Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern section of the front line near Chasiv Yar, in the southern flank of Toretsk, in the direction of the east of Pokrovsk, in the northern and southern flanks of Kurakhove, in the direction of Velyka Novosilka. The Russians have also advanced further in the direction of the Lubnya River line, where the Russians are storming the Ukrainian positions alongside it. Starting out in the northern direction, the Russians have managed to advance towards and gain a foothold within Viktorovka, following the Ukrainian counterattack to regain control over the forest lines to the west of Viktorovka. The Russians have now entered it from the northern side, where they have control over the forest line there. This is to isolate the Ukrainian forces in the southern parts near Viktorovka and Nikolsky by flanking it from the southern and northern directions at the same time in a pincer maneuver. This allows the Russians to improve their positions here and to separate these two towns from Malaya Lugnia further north. The Russians are taking advantage of their positions in the forest lines to the south and to the north of these two villages, as well as the fortified positions in the area. The objective is to gain control over both towns, which will allow the Russians to operate within the supply route in and out of Malaya Lugnia from the southern direction, expanding further to the eastern direction as well, by launching operations from the east towards the west and from the west towards the east to cut off the remaining towns. Viktorovka and Nikolsky are both towns with little to no housing. There's not a lot of positions the Ukrainians can occupy. There's not a lot of fortified positions. Therefore, these are both vulnerable. The Russians getting control over both of which will allow them to strike the final remaining supply routes for the Ukrainian forces in the towns from Malaya Lugnia and to the north, and this will significantly improve the positions of the Russians. Therefore, it is a low-risk, high-reward goal for them to gain control of these two villages and then hit the supply routes of the Ukrainians. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance further in Chasiv Yar, gaining control over parts of the forest area, moving towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area here within the forest area. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the fortified areas and the forest patch to gain control over the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. This allows them to slowly move towards the western parts of the city as well as the surrounding towns. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the crossing and expand it further. With the capture of the remaining parts of the eastern district of Chasiv Yar, the Russians are now moving in to cut off the fortified positions within the forest area itself, gaining full control over which will allow the Russians to have yet another area where they can gather troops and start moving towards the western parts of the city and the surrounding towns. The Russians are here looking to expand the areas where they can gather troops as much as possible, because the natural rule in warfare is if you have more soldiers, then there's more you can do. However, it's very risky to gather more troops nowadays in modern warfare due to drones, activity, artillery, and so on, that all bombards your positions. Therefore, the Russians are looking to gain control over areas that can sustain artillery fire, or areas that is difficult for drones to detect soldiers, so that they can gather more troops and launch larger operations. Moving on to the Toretsk direction, the Russians have managed to advance northwest of Leonidivka, gaining control over the remaining parts of the village and start a move towards Novospassky. The Russians have already gained control over a foothold across the river line, and with this, the fighting is taking place to the north of Cherbenivka, where the Russians are looking to expand in the northern direction towards the school area and to gain control over the remaining parts of Cherbenivka, while at the same time, with the new move towards Novospassky, the Russians are switching the offensive operations out of Toretsk itself and into the surrounding towns in the western parts of the city. This is to gain control over the remaining fortified areas and to expand their foothold across the area along the river line. This is to move alongside the river line up towards the fortified line of the Ukrainians south of the reservoir, southwest of the city of Kostyantynivka, gain control over the supply routes in and out of the area here, which is the massive defensive fortified area south of Kostyantynivka, north of Avdiivka. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to capture the village of Baranivka. This is a very small village, mostly forest patches, and a fortified position. Russians are here moving onwards to cut off the supply route in the western parts of the fortified zone north of Avdiivka. This entire area here north of Avdiivka, in between that and Kostyantynivka, is a massive fortified area with several lines of defense and massive defensive positions. Russians are looking to cut off the supply routes in and out of this area, following the capture of Toretsk, and now with the push north of Vyshtyshenka, this allowed the Russians to cut off the supplies and force a withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from this pocket. And considering the trend of what the Ukrainians have been doing so far, it is actually unlikely that they will withdraw from it, even if they end up in an operational encirclement. We'll get more on that later, but it seems that the Ukrainians refuse to withdraw even in the most dire situations. What we're seeing is that the Russians are moving towards both of the supply lines on a very wide angle. However, it is not a risky maneuver for the Russians because they've managed to capture Toretsk. Following that, they're able to concentrate their forces there and launch strong operations towards the reservoir. And with the reservoir as the strong northern flank, Toretsk is a strong eastern flank. They only have to look out from the western flank, but they have several towns alongside that, which creates a strong flank there as well. If they're able to cut off the supply lines, then they'll be able to significantly limit the Ukrainian supplies, while at the same time they have the supply lines through Orelivka and Toretsk, or through Avdiivka to the south, which means that they have proper supply lines there. In turn, the Russians will also be able to push in the western direction, where they don't really have to go that far because the main push is going to come from the Toretsk direction. Instead, here in the western direction, the Russians have to focus on cutting off the road and limiting the supplies in that direction. And with the capture of the northern parts, then the Ukrainian forces will be operationally encircled, would have to supply through the open fields. Our withdrawal will have to go through the open fields. So Russian FPV drones will be very active in that direction. Gaining control over the entire area of the fortified zone north of Avdiivka will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions in this direction. There will be the direct highway from Donetsk city all the way to Kostyantynivka from the south. There will be a road highway from Orelivka through Toretsk and towards Kostyantynivka from the southeast. And with control over Chasiv Yar, which the Russians are slowly winning, they'll be able to have a road from Bakhmut towards Kostyantynivka from the east. If they also continue their siege of Pokrovsk or gain control over the intersection here, they'll have another road from the west. And this will be all of the highways except the one that goes through the defensive line itself, and the Russians will be able to siege Kostyantynivka from 3 to 4 different directions. This will have a huge impact on the siege of Kostyantynivka and will significantly improve the positions of the Russians in the area. It will also strengthen the Russian ability to launch operations in the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, because with a secure flank on the eastern section, they'll be able to concentrate their forces and launch deeper operations here near Vyshtyshenka and along the intersection to reach the northern parts. Therefore, we see that there is a significant importance and significance to the defensive zone of the Ukrainians in the north of Avdiivka. Yet the situation continues to deteriorate for the Ukrainians with the Russian capture of Toretsk and now push north of Vyshtyshenka to cut off the supply routes. Moving on to the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have managed to advance both in the direction of Sribne, where they are bypassing Novoandrivka in its entirety to move along the forest lines southwest of Yasenove to move towards Sribne. The Russians may continue looking to advance further along the forest lines, however, it is already fairly deep. This means there will likely be a combined push from the northern direction and from the southern direction to bypass Novoandrivka by flanking it from both sides, forcing a withdrawal for the Ukrainian forces out of the village and onwards to Sribne, where the Russians can continue their operations by flanking further alongside the northern and southern flanks and continue doing so all the way towards Kurakhove in the direction of the Dnipro Oblast border area. The reason this is possible is because there's no significant fortified positions in the area. The Russians have control over the northern and southern flanks, and therefore the villages themselves are exposed, they are vulnerable, they have no supply lines except for the western direction, and their forces are all concentrated along a singular line. Therefore, the Russians can move through the forest lines to capture the positions of the Ukrainians and pressure them out of the villages towards the border area of the next region. The Russians have also managed to advance west of Petropavlivka, gaining control over some fortified positions and forest lines as they move further towards Andreevka on the northern flank. In the direction of Velyka Novosilka, the Russian encirclement of Ukrainian forces continues. They're moving through the eastern parts of the town to gain control over the entirety of it. Their current objective is to connect the eastern and western sides, completely cut off the Ukrainian positions in the south of Velyka Novosilka, and then gain control over the remaining parts. The Ukrainians are attempting to break through the Russian positions within Remivka to push out of the town and break out of the encirclement. They did not withdraw from Velyka Novosilka despite the increasing pressure from the Russian forces in the northern, eastern, southern, and western directions. This led to a complete encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. The only withdrawal now is through the Mokry River, and that is a very costly withdrawal route. Therefore, they are betting on a counteroffensive towards Remivka to push out of the town and withdraw towards the fortified positions northwest of Velyka Novosilka. However, it is looking increasingly likely that the forces there will be decimated and that they will have no way out except for an extremely costly one, where in Volodar, 50% of the forces that tried to withdraw were wiped out. In this time, in Velyka Novosilka, it's likely to be 9 out of 10 at best for the Ukrainians that will be lost in the withdrawal. How many soldiers do the Ukrainians have in Velyka Novosilka? That is not known. It is likely in the hundreds, and the fortified positions likely have hundreds of more. This is likely a battalion-sized unit within Velyka Novosilka, and in the fortified position, an additional battalion-sized unit. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.